guys, and welcome to the Paletteful Packs YouTube channel. My name is Alice, and here in front of me I have the November 2019 Paletteful Premiere Pack. So let's go ahead and open it up and see what's inside. So here's our first look at everything that's inside the November Paletteful Pack. So the theme for this month is M. Graham oils, and it is a grayscale challenge. So as you can see, everything in here is shades of gray. There's some black, there's some white, so we're gonna have some fun. So the first thing that I pulled out of the box is this brush. So this is the Robert Simmons white Sable brush. And because it's a Sable brush, it's gonna have really great springiness to it. It's gonna have a nice flexible point and a really sharp working edge. But because this is white Sable, not red Sable, it's gonna hold more color, it's gonna clean easier, and it's going to last way longer. You can also use it for acrylic or watercolor as well as oils. But if you do use this for oil paint, definitely stick with using this brush for oil paint. So just a general tip there. And Robert Simmons brushes are actually guaranteed for life, which is really, really great. So the next thing that we have in here are the actual oil paints themselves. So these are M. Graham Artist oil colors, and the colors that you're gonna get are ivory, black, Payne's gray, and titanium white. So you have a perfect range of colors for this gray scale challenge. So M. Graham Artist oil color is made with pure walnut oil, which is going to really enhance the brilliance and the clarity, and it's going to help resist like fading and yellowing. They're also solvent free, and they don't have any fillers or any additives, which is really, really wonderful to hear. And they are also intermixable with all other oil colors. So if you already have some oils at home, you can just add these to your collection and mix them in. So that is wonderful, and I am so excited to get to painting with these guys. So the next thing that I found in the November box is this M. Graham walnut oil. So as I just mentioned, the oil colors are made with pure walnut oil and they don't have any solvents. And that is something that makes these unique because you don't need to use solvent to clean your brushes with these paints. You can use this walnut oil. Walnut oil effectively removes color from your artist brushes, and it's a natural vegetable oil, so it's not going to evaporate or strip your brushes and make them really, really dry. It's also going to slow drying, enhance flow, and increase the sheen of your painting, so it's kind of a multi-functional product. So then we get to the surfaces, and there are 3 canvas surfaces included in this month's box. So your smallest is going to be a 5x7 canvas panel, and that's going to be great for you to start testing on and kind of figure out how oil paints work, especially if you're new to them. Then when you're feeling a little bit more comfortable, there's an 8x10 canvas panel, so you can move up to that one. And then when you're feeling really, really confident, there's an 8x10 stretched canvas with these really nice deep sides. So you get a bunch of these to play around with, and they are all by Art Alternatives. Also by Art Alternatives is this palette knife. This is the last thing that I pulled out of the box, and it's so helpful to have a palette knife whenever you're using oils because they're such a multifunctional product. You can use them to mix your oil paint, you can use it to apply your oil paint Bob Ross style, you can manipulate the textures, and you can even use it for scraping and cleaning up your palette when you're done. So it's just a useful tool to have. So this is everything that you're going to get in the November 2019 Paletteful Packs Premiere Pack for the M. Graham Oil Gray Challenge Edition. I am so excited to play with these oils, so let's just dive right in and make some art. Alright, so I decided to work on the largest canvas, the 8x10 stretched canvas. I just prefer working with something with a little bit of deeper sides, and it's less likely to slip around on my desk. So that's what I started with. And I know that oils can be quite tricky for a lot of people, and I have always enjoyed oils, and hopefully sharing my technique will help some of you guys out a little bit. So the first thing that I do is I water down a little bit of that Payne's gray using the walnut oil. And I'm gonna use this to very, very loosely sketch in the general idea of my picture, and then I'm gonna start using very, very thin layers to just start blocking out the overall shades and values of the piece, where it's going to be really, really dark, where it's going to be a lot brighter. And the reason for this is that you really do want to try to work from the thinnest layer to the thickest layer in oil paint. Oil paint takes quite a while to dry. So you want to make sure that you're not putting a really thick layer on the bottom that's going to take like 2 weeks to dry. You want to start with those thinnest layers because they're going to dry easier, and you can start building up over the top of them. It's definitely possible to finish an oil painting in just 1 or 2 sessions. It just really depends on the technique that you use and how detailed you want to get. Speaking of details, one of my biggest tips for using oils is to spend very little time on that initial sketch. As you saw when I first started this out, I just very, very loosely blocked in the overall shape of the face, where the eyes were going to be, where the lips were going to be, a circle for the nose. I didn't bother with any detailed sketching, and the reason for that is it's going to get covered up and you're not really going to be able to use it as a guideline for very much at all. When you're working with oil or even with an acrylic paint, I think that it's much more useful to kind of manipulate the shapes on the actual canvas versus trying to get this perfect sketch and then fill in the lines. It's kind of a waste of your time. You're just going to end up having to manipulate it anyway. So I would recommend just using a very thin layer to kind of get out the basic shape and composition that you're working with. And then you can start building layers up. So what I'm working on right now is just kind of building layers up, one over the other, in thinner and getting thicker layers as I get closer to the top. So there's definitely some things about oil paint that can be tricky when you're first starting out. As we've mentioned before, oil paint takes quite a while to dry, so when you're trying to paint on top of it, the oil can mix with the colors underneath, and that can make it really difficult to add in really dark darks or really white whites when you're adding them on top of a mid-tone. So it's really important, I think, to make sure that you have at least some kind of idea as to what areas in your piece are going to be very light and what areas are going to be very dark. It's also helpful, I would say, to work from dark to light. It's easier to add white into your wet paint and lighten something, but adding black in and trying to get it darker and darker and darker is so much harder, in my opinion. I find that the white just muddies and it'll lighten, and no matter how hard you try, you'll always end up with a light kind of gray. And one of the ways that I find oil paint so wonderful is that you can do that blending on the canvas. So as I mentioned, you can add in white or black or whatever your color is and mix it with that wet paint on the canvas. And this is something that I did quite a bit, especially in the face area. I kind of started with this light gray, and then I was able to add in white for the highlights and then go and just dry that brush off and then flick the edges to blend it with just a very soft dry brush, just kind of feathering those edges. In terms of wiping off your brush, I definitely recommend using some sort of like rag or towel. Definitely not like a paper towel or anything like that, because it is going to get super, super messy and this paint stays wet forever. And the texture is really going to help clean off the oil paint on your brush, because your walnut oil is going to help like loosen it. But after a while, that walnut oil is going to get very filled with pigment, and you also don't want to be wasting that. So I find that it's really, really useful to consistently be wiping my brush off on a little rag as I go. And something that also helps with is paint control. So something that I talk about a lot in watercolor is water control. So controlling how much water you have on your brush, that's very important for that. And for oil paint, I think the amount of paint you have on your brush is extremely important. Not just the amount of paint, but the consistency of the paint itself. So if you just want to very softly and subtly blend something, you want your brush to have as little paint on it as possible, have it quite dry, and as I mentioned before, you just kind of want to feather between the edges of those two wet colors that you've placed down. If you want to kind of start carving out chunks and adding in highlights and some darker areas, but you're not necessarily looking to blend things, then you can kind of have a little bit more paint on there. And that's going to kind of blend in, but not fully go away. And then if you really are trying to get a dark or a bright white and you're trying to lay that down on top of the wet paint, one thing that really helps is to have a lot of paint and have a decently thick amount of paint. And what you can do with that is you can literally almost smear it very carefully on top of where you're going. And it's less like you're painting on top of the wet paint and more like you're placing the paint on top of the wet paint. If that makes any sense at all, it can be a lot more useful to do this with a palette knife. I personally am not the best at painting with a palette knife. I use them a lot more for mixing, but if you enjoy working with a palette knife to apply paint, that's something that they are very, very useful with. This technique is definitely one that's going to lend itself best to paintings with thicker paint or like impasto. So if you like that thick paint, you know, like those layers and it's got texture and you can feel it, then that's a technique that you're going to love. But if you want your oil painting to have a very flat, smooth surface, then you're going to want to use the oil paint in lots of very thin layers. And again, that's where that walnut oil is really, really going to come in handy, because you can use that to kind of thin out those paints and you can use them to glaze one on top of the other, creating these beautiful transparent layers. So oil paint is just so very, very versatile. If you do use that technique, yes, you will have to wait for it to dry between each layer, but you can create really beautiful results with it. So oil paint can be a little bit tricky to learn, but it is so versatile and there are so many beautiful effects that you can create with it. I really hope that this demo helped give you a little bit more of an idea as to how you can use the oil paints that came in your Paletteful pack, as well as some ideas on just how to use oil paint in general. Hopefully it was helpful. If you'd like to get your own Paletteful pack, there is going to be a link in the description box below, so click that, check out our website to see all of our options. I will see you next month. Thank you so much for watching and have a great day. Bye!